Hi everyone, this is Dr. Ray. I'm here to walk you through the basics of MLA citation. I do want to remind you that all the information that I'm providing is available on the Purdue OWL website. So if you go to Google, type in Purdue OWL, OWL is for Online Writing Lab, and then MLA, you could put in paraphrased statement, direct quote, long quote. They will have this information as well. So moving forward, what is an in-text citation? These are required. So if you look here, it's what appears in the parentheses. And what it does is it tells your reader directly where the information you're providing comes from. So let's unpack this a little bit. Jim Carrey teaches us about happiness when he says, quote, "I think everybody should get rich and famous so they can see that it's not the answer." And then in parentheses, you have 263. Clearly it comes from a book, and on page 263, we'll find this quote. We'll talk about works cited later in the course, but in your works cited, it would tell me where to find this book that Jim Carrey's writing is included. If you look at this second example, everyone would be happier if they could, quote, "get rich and famous so they can see that it's not the answer." If you'll notice in this in-text citation, I have his last name. The reason is because in the first example, it's clearly noted who the author is, so it's not required. If there could be any confusion about who the quote is attributed to, that needs to be noted in your in-text citation. Finally, Jim Carrey says if every individual could briefly experience celebrity and wealth, we would realize it doesn't bring lasting happiness or joy. I paraphrased that, even though I bumbled it a little bit. I took his ideas and put it in my own words, but it's still his ideas, so I still have to give him credit. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward, but that's why that page number is still included, to tell my reader exactly where that information was taken from. So quoting, this should be pretty clear. Quotes are identical to the original. They're typically a narrow segment of the source, and they're framed by quotation marks. So there is a temptation, I would say, to quote too much, and you really only want to cherry pick those insightful, brilliant quotes that really support your argument. And again, if the wording is just so great, you need it exactly as the author had it, that's when you put in the quotation marks. Of course, they match the source word for word, and you've clearly attributed it to the original author. And again, you use the quotes when the actual words are so important they cannot be replaced. So there's a great article by James Hamblin called "By Experiences, Not Things," and that's where I've taken this quote from. James Hamblin argues that no object is, quote, intrinsically valuable except in whatever promise of happiness it carries. The direct quote tells me those are his words exactly, and of course in the parentheses, the number 2 tells me it's from page 2 of that source. Ellipses are key. So an ellipsis, a string of ellipses do, is they let you remove part of a text. So an ellipses is a string of 3 periods with spaces between them and a space on either side. An ellipsis tells your reader that part of a passage is missing from the original. It's helpful in keeping a passage short and to the point instead of including unnecessary information. So perhaps the person you're citing, like they're just very wordy, or they've got some unnecessary facts and like a list and you don't need the unnecessary ones. Ellipses are sometimes used in fiction, like "she said I love you, but I don't know, ... Only use ellipses in academic papers if you've dropped something from a quote. Don't use them in that way. When you omit words at the end of a sentence using ellipsis, you need to include the punctuation mark that originally ended in. So I will show you what that looks like in a second. So here's an example where the middle of a sentence has been dropped. The Empire State Building is located on the west side of 5th Avenue, and tenants enter the building through an Art Deco lobby. These ellipses show that there was more information there. It was actually like the address, and I just decided that's not relevant to what I'm trying to say. I just want to give some basic facts. And so the ellipses tells you, the reader, that that part has been taken out. So here's an original passage by someone named Smith. The Empire State Building has 102 stories. It stands proudly in downtown Manhattan and receives millions of visitors each year. Its construction was completed in 1931. So maybe I think, well, everyone knows that it's in Manhattan and it receives all these visitors each year. I don't want to share that. That's just filler in my paper. So it'd be a smart point to use the ellipses to take out that section and just include the crucial facts. If the ellipses appeared at the end of the sentence, you would have the original period still appear outside the citation. So keep that in mind. Long quotes. Okay, you want to use these sparingly. So if you were typing this really great quote into your paper and it takes up more than 4 lines, you need to format it as a long quote. They don't have opening and closing quotation marks because the way it's formatted in your paper lets the reader know it's a citation. It's called a block quote sometimes. We use these terms interchangeably. When using a block quote, the period, if you look here, appears before the citation. This is the only time this happens. To accomplish this, you would hit enter if you started writing the quote, highlight the whole thing and hit tab twice. I think that's the easiest approach. I would not average more than one long quote per every 2 or 3 pages because at some point they start to look like filler. I have a great story. When I started teaching 15 years ago, I'm dating myself now, I had a freshman who wrote a paper on the legalization of marijuana, which, that's great, fine, interesting topic. 2 out of 3 of her pages were one giant long quote. And she's like, well, I indented it and cited it. And the point was she didn't say anything herself. All she did was show me she could copy and paste. So long quotes are when the quote is just so essential, so integral to what you're trying to prove that you need to include it, but use them sparingly. Keep that in mind. I would recommend never have them go over 6, 8 lines tops, because then again, it just starts to appear like filler. Paraphrasing is key, and it can help us avoid some of this really long citation. So paraphrasing involves putting a specific passage or example from a source into your own words. So it's a piece of evidence from your argument, like I did with the Jim Carrey example up top, where I took his idea, but I used my own language. But I still noted a page number because I have to give credit where credit is due. It's typically shorter than the original. So maybe it took the author 3 sentences to say it, but you're getting all that content down in 1. So you've got the same ideas, but maybe you've made it more concise. So there's a great essay, Malcolm X's Homemade Education, where I've paraphrased something from the beginning of that. In Malcolm X's essay, Homemade Education, he describes how the intellectual inmates he encountered in Norfolk prison inspired him to better educate himself. So I still have that page number because this is information or an example from his writing, but I've put it in my own language. Now you might ask yourself, why am I going to paraphrase when it's so much easier to quote, right? Copy and paste or just type it over, saves so much time. Paraphrasing is so much more valuable. It shows your reader that you get what you're talking about. To take an idea and put it in your own words, you have to understand it and be familiar with it. It helps you understand it better, right? By being able to rehash it in your own language. It helps you think critically about the whole text. It keeps you from quoting too much, right? You don't want to lose your voice in a text where the whole essay you're writing just feels like one long quote. By paraphrasing, you're keeping your voice active, even if you're sharing a lot of outside information. And it improves your writing skills. This will help you in any future class and even in future careers, being able to take an idea, break it down in your own language, hopefully make it more clear and concise for your reader or listener. Signal phrases. So if I wrote you a beautiful paper about, let's stick with the legalization of marijuana, and it's convincing and it's powerful, but every time I bring up an outside source, I say Smith writes, Hamblin writes, X writes, it starts to get repetitive and mind-numbing. So signal phrases introduce someone else's work. It's a signal that, hey, a quote or someone else's idea is coming, but you want some variety. So here I have Hamlin states, quote, research has shown that experiences bring people more happiness than do possessions. There are so many signal phrases. You can just Google signal phrases, hit Purdue OWL signal phrases, and this is just some, but different verbs that like show that an idea is coming, and they work for both paraphrase statements and direct quotes. The quote sandwich is the last thing I want to hit on because this is clutch, my friend. I will be writing this in your papers and your homeworks if you fail to do this. Is just like a sandwich, every great quote in a paper, paraphrased or direct, has 3 parts. A statement introducing the quote, like a phrase, right? Like Malcolm X writes. The quote itself, whether it's paraphrased or not, including that citation, and then anchor it into your paper. Explain how it ties to your main argument. Unpack that quote and tell me what it means. Don't leave it hanging there because this paper is mostly about your critical thinking and ideas. The quote's just there for some supporting evidence. So here's my example. Malcolm X writes, I imagine that one of the biggest troubles with colleges is there are too many distractions, too much panty raiding in fraternities. Where else but in a prison could I attack my ignorance by studying 15 hours a day? And there's a quotation mark, and there's the citation, and since it's part of the whole original sentence, I have a period. Though written over 50 years ago, X recognizes that the culture surrounding American universities has become more about socializing and youthful rebellion and less about education. So if I was writing a paper about what I think is wrong with the American college system, I've included this quote to show that even 50 years ago, Malcolm X showed he could get a better education in a prison cell with books than you might at an American campus that is focused on partying and fraternities and that kind of culture. So this is a great example of the quote sandwich. So that is my spiel on citation. For further information, there's a sample paragraph there I'll post for you. I always suggest go to Purdue OWL, and I will show you how that works. And again, Purdue University, OWL is for Online Writing Lab, and I can put in something like MLA citation. And boom, the whole style guide is online. That's why I never assign a writing handbook, because it's all free and online thanks to Purdue OWL. Any other issues you encounter in my course, you can search. They have things on everything from fragments to works cited to thesis statements, body paragraphs. So keep that in mind. I'm here as a resource, and so are our friends at Purdue. Cheers, guys.